Hello, this is Mike Swanson. This is a new segment of the Past American Century. Got a very special guest with me today. I'm speaking of Carmine Savastano, who wrote the book Two Princes and a King and runs the website TPAAK. How you doing today, Carmine?
I'm doing good, Mike. How are you been?
Oh, I'm doing good, and thanks for taking the time to talk with me and do this. The other week, we did a segment about Allen Dulles. People can go back to that video. They just type a look at the young Allen Dulles, and that will load up on YouTube. And this is really part two. We added part one with Allen Dulles just about to ascend to the directorship of the Central Intelligence Agency. So that was kind of about his background and so forth. But now we're going to get into some of the stuff he actually did in the 1950s.
Yeah, I wanted to go into that, and like you said, it was, I think we, had a few brief comments on some of the things that happened, but I wanted to start just before, as you said, his ascension to the directorship, and the Dulles brothers were professionally skyrocketing during the early years of the 1950s, and greater successes were likely on the horizon until tragedy struck the family when Allen M. Dulles, the director's son, or the future director's son, was gravely injured in the Korean War. The younger Dulles suffered a permanent brain injury from a mortar fragment that he never recovered from, and this likely had a profound emotional consequences upon the ambitious Dulles family. It may be the loss and damage to the future of the Dulles family had personally incited their pursuits against communist allied forces and allied nations. And I think that's something that isn't considered very often, is that there might have been a very personal stake for Dulles in all the things that he did.
So his son was gravely injured by the North Korean or the Chinese Communist forces during the Korean War.
Yeah, supposedly Chinese Communist forces, a piece of shrapnel struck his brain.
Well, how bad was it,
Well, they said he never recovered, so it was the rest of his life, and he was struck in the head, and I believe I have some information on it. He was evacuated to Japan, then to Bethesda Naval Hospital in Maryland. Dulles was released to his parents' care, but subsequently spent many years in a series of hospitals in the United States, as well as Bellevue Sanatorium in Switzerland.
Ooh.
He eventually moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico, where his sister Joan Dulles lives, and he never recovered from his injuries.
Wow. Sounds like he was so bad off he couldn't even live with his parents.
Well, yeah, it was, they said that basically the injury caused a severe impairment of his short-term memory. He had difficulty processing the events of his life. He also was deaf in his left ear, had impaired eyesight, and the injury resulted in clinical paranoia, but it was evidenced during some of the interview despite the medication he took, because they did an interview with him in the 50s.
Was his name Allen? Was he a junior? Was he Allen Dulles Jr.?
No, he was Allen M. Dulles. Allen Welsh Dulles is his dad's name.
Okay.
Yeah, the director is Allen W. Dulles. But yeah, so I think that probably played, on any level you think about Dulles, whether you are a fan or a critic, it would definitely affect anyone on a human level for this to happen. This is his son. This is the future of the family. He's very ambitious. He's very status-oriented. It's the 1950s. This is probably one of the worst things that could have happened, because this has removed his son's ability to rise to the level of his predecessors. It's made him non-functional publicly. The Dulleses apparently, realized that they couldn't take care of him and put him in sanitariums, which basically locked him off from public view until his sister brought him with her.
Well, I'm just looking I found something. I was just looking on the internet, and there's an oral history interview he did. I guess this is what you found too. part of the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library.
Yeah.
It's a veteran thing, and the person doing the interview says, note to reader, he has difficulty processing the events of his life.
Yeah.
So that's bad. Well, but anyway, tragic, no doubt.
But I definitely think that probably played a role, and it basically rendered Dulles' son to never be able to be anything like his father. And he had a very promising career in the military. He had graduated from a good school, just like his father had. He was walking in the paths of John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles and their predecessors who were in government. And then the year before Dulles becomes CIA director, this happens.
I'm going to turn this off. It's too weird. This thing has a strange note in it I've never seen before for a interview.
Uh-huh.
It says, readers of the oral history memoir should bear in mind that this is a transcript of the spoken word, and that the interviewer, interviewee, and editor sought to preserve the informal conversational style that is inherent in such historical sources. The library is not responsible for the factual accuracy of the memoir, nor for the views expressed therein. We leave these for the reader to judge. It's like they really, they want to distance themselves from the transcript and what was said.
Well, I'm sure that the Dulles family is still very powerful.
But
sure
anyway, I cut that off.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, how do you think this affected the father? You think it would make him more angry at the communists, or make him want to throw himself into his work more?
Oh, so, yeah.
I
I certainly think that it would make him definitely hate the communists on a level that probably wasn't present earlier. You know, I mean, I think any person, imagine that.
Sure.
Imagine anyone. Your son is forever mentally broken because he was fighting communists. And your job is to fight communists. Yeah, I think it's wholly expected that would occur. And, you know, especially in the 50s. Back then, everybody's repressed emotionally. As a rule, they didn't show them, you know, weakness in public. They didn't cry in public. Men did not act like that. So Dulles had no real outlet for that other than, I would assume, his work and his extracurricular activities.
Well, he was certainly an anti-communist crusader, and his brother was too. There's no doubt about it. I mean, I'm writing about the Vietnam War, and I've got a couple stories where a head of state visits John Foster Dulles when he's Secretary of State under Eisenhower, and he lectures these dignitaries about what's going on in their country, saying they don't understand communism, and it's just kind of crazy. But so anyway, with Allen Dulles though, how does he, you know, wage the war against communism?
Well, I think that his management style, you know, it leads to a mixture of reasonable success and notable failures that Dulles would not face until his later greatest public error in the early 1960s. His policy choices were previewed in former critiques. I think we can look back to some of the stuff we talked about in the last episode about the 1949 Dulles report that criticized former CIA Director Hillenkoetter's restraint and desired more compartmentalization and independent control for operational components of the agency. So this desire would decentralize control of the operations, and it was contradictory to the direct management and accountability style of Walter Bedell Smith, who was another of his predecessors. This intentional blurring of control and management of assets would create several future problems and questionable actions that often left responsibility too diffused among related groups to hold any single person accountable. It was using this less than defined and reactive system that Allen Dulles believed he and the CIA might square off against the Soviet Union for the opening rounds of the Cold War. As we mentioned prior in 1953, U.S. President Eisenhower appoints John Foster Dulles to the position of Secretary of State. and Allen Dulles still had to deal with Walter Bedell Smith, the current CIA director. The Dulles brothers were quite aware they would not be able to force Smith out or threaten him, so they decided upon seeming bribery. Smith resigned as CIA director to become Undersecretary of State in the service of the older Dulles brother, and in 1953 passed a newly minted Director of Central Intelligence, Allen Dulle, to the chair. And now, sitting at the helm of the agency, Dulles was far different from the stabilizing Director Smith, and began several proxy war plans that his predecessors likely did not intend.
Well, what do you mean they bribed him?
Well, Smith, after being director of the CIA for a few years, he could have stayed on. I don't see any reason why he would have suddenly gotten tired of it. But Dulles had tried once in 1949 to open the way by getting rid of Hillenkoetter to get to the director's chair, and that failed. They put Smith in. And Smith wasn't going anywhere. And Smith couldn't be threatened. And he couldn't be forced out.
Right.
So John Foster Dulles gave him, in my opinion, a political bone to open the seat up for his brother. He said, you can be Undersecretary of State, which at the time, though CIA director now might seem very prominent, why would anybody give it up? Then it wasn't. Then the CIA had only been around 6 years. It was a new agency. And it was largely the whipping boy of the Department of State and the Department of Defense.
So, in other words, at this moment, the Central Intelligence Agency wasn't really as important or influential as it would become.
No, it was nothing like by the end of Dulles' tenure.
Okay.
Yeah, Dulles definitely, if you want to give him some credit for something, empowering the CIA is certainly something he did.
When you talked about bribery, I thought you were going to say...
Oh, no, not
no, I thought you were going to talk about how he got a position on the United Fruit Company as a director, and the Dulles brothers, you know, the United Fruit Company had been a client of their law firm.
Well,
and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I will mention the United Fruit Company in a bad way later, but it won't have to do with bribery.
Okay.
just possible influencing. In this, no, I would say this was a pretty much over-the-table open bribe.
Okay.
You know, they're pretty much like, you give him the job, and I'll give you a better job. How's that sound?
Yeah, sure.
You know, so. So one flaw that repeated media reports focus on was Dulles' penchant for womanizing and having inappropriate professional and diplomatic relationships with females. The affairs, in my view, are of no interest, but examples of the women that Dulles chose to seduce do provide a serious problem for claims of his professionalism. For instance, one of his alleged mistresses was Mary Bancroft, the step-granddaughter of the Wall Street Journal's publisher. Dulles hired her for support in his OSS base in Switzerland. Reportedly, he stated to her, "We can let the work cover the romance and the romance cover the work." And Bancroft, according to the article, fell completely in love with Dulles and formed an enduring association throughout the 50s. Yet, can any rational intelligence professional not see the conflict of interest? Dulles was violating the most basic principles of maintaining a professional working relationship with Bancroft and potentially compromising OSS projects because he was busy having an affair with a staffer. Based on the information we covered last episode, it's not as if Dulles was busy doing much else, but I think he could have spent his time in Bern more productively. The longest-serving CIA director's repeated desire for the spotlight, too, was a problem, and it was reinforced by his appearance on the cover of Time magazine in August 1953, following his appointment. As the first civilian leader, Dulles had inherited a reformed agency that had more clearly defined limitations and organizational goals, empowered with greater self-determination than his predecessors enjoyed. This was likely not just from the reforms and official reviews of the intelligence, but also Allen's brother John Foster Dulles was controlling the U.S. State Department, and this prevented the usual attempts by the State Department to constantly interfere with the agency. Facing just half the problems that Hillenkoetter and Smith endured, one would imagine that Dulles would have a cakewalk as the director, but the image of Dulles as a mastermind with all the advantages of station would prove misleading. The first target of the Dulles brothers' intervention policies against presumed communist or national security threats was the democratically elected president of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh. The Iranian leader had, in defiance of England and other Western nations with corporate interests in Iranian oil supplies, nationalized these companies and seized their holdings. When related English officials and companies realized they alone could not stop this action, they pled with the youthful CIA to help them stop Mossadegh. The CIA, under Dulles, soon collaborated with its English intelligence counterparts and subsequently destabilized and removed Mossadegh from power under Operation TP Ajax. Operation PB Success in Guatemala during 1954 removed communist-aligned President Jacobo Arbenz from power. Beyond the declared communist threat, other likely motivations for initiating PB Success emerged from multiple U.S. corporate interests concerned about related business nationalization. One concerned party, the United Fruit Company, whose representing law firm the Dulles brothers had worked for, was a strong advocate for government action. According to the book The Brothers by Stephen Kinzer, preceding the coup, both the ambassador to Guatemala and the assistant secretary of Inter-American Affairs were replaced for allegedly attempting diplomacy in defiance of offensive policy John Foster Dulles had decided upon. Once the Dulles brothers had decided that Arbenz would not be allowed to remain in power, they toppled the leadership of Guatemala with the Eisenhower administration's consent. Yet direct military intervention was but one of the many weapons employed against communist and other political foes. Another troublesome reported affair with a powerful woman occurred in 1958 and is based on the account of Dulles meeting the Queen of Greece for romance at CIA headquarters. And following this occasion, the Queen was reported to have stated, quote, loving that man, according to officials. This, if accurate, would again represent not just repeated unprofessional conduct, but highlight the possibility for diplomatic problems if the romance had gone wrong. It features that despite all the wrangling and Dulles failing to be, if Dulles failed to be the Casanova he envisioned, he could have undone the efforts of the U.S. State Department. Such a failure could have endangered the national security of America that all his unlikely later plots were supposedly designed to protect. You see, that's the problem with it. It's not that he did it. I'm not going to be a moral judge, and I think historians should. I don't care about what he was doing in his private time. That's his business. But that he was doing it with state officials of other countries and that he was doing it with his co-workers and his underlings is the problem.
Yeah, that's pretty out there. That's for sure.
Yeah, it can't be accepted. It's not professional. It can compromise you in ways that it's so funny because it's lectures from people like Dulles that tell you not to do this if you look in some of the files. Like, you're not supposed to do this because this can compromise you to other intelligence groups. Because if somebody had found out about the affair between Dulles and the Queen, then they could have then blackmailed them.
But he couldn't control himself, or he just...
Well, then he shouldn't have been CIA director.
He just thought he's so powerful he can do anything.
Yeah, one way, either or. Either he was out of control and shouldn't have been CIA director, or he couldn't control himself and he shouldn't have been CIA director. See, as I'm sure people might have learned by now, I have a very different view historically than other people do. They want to talk about what an evil guy he was. I think he was an incompetent. I don't think he should have been allowed to be CIA director. He might have been good at the State Department. He might have done his job right sometimes, but he did so many stupid things that would have compromised the CIA.
Actually, well, I mean, it's been a while. I mean,
maybe it's vanity. Maybe.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've read some of the biography or two about him. But it's been 6 years ago, so I mean, memory's not exact in every single detail. But the impression I got from it is that he was not like a detailed, hands-on person. That he had underlings that would do all the real work and the detailed work, and he was like going to parties and stuff a lot.
Yeah.
Like the Georgetown set circuit, the cocktail parties around Georgetown, then other places, and as you have already said, he was having lots of affairs. So, and he was also very a public relations type person. He got himself on the cover of Time magazine.
Yeah. Well, I think
in the mid-1950s when he's CIA director and stuff like that. So,
which I mean, you might consider that a public relations boon, but at the same time, it's also a huge failure because you're in charge of a secret organization. The head of the secret organization shouldn't be on the cover of magazines.
yeah, I mean, I can't name off the top of my head any of the KGB directors after Beria.
Yeah.
And I can't think of right now. I have looked it up in the past, but I can't tell you who the head of the intelligence in North Korea is.
Yeah. Yeah, his addiction to image. Dulles would have been perhaps a great Secretary of State, but he wasn't a great Director of Central Intelligence.
Well, he had his brother doing that.
Well,
he could do that because his brother was there.
Exactly. But he was very much the more... I'm loath to use the term, but it's what's coming to mind. He was the frat boy of the Dulles brothers. He was the one who wanted to glad hand and hang out with the ladies and drink and get lots of credit, and he was ambitious, but he wasn't so ambitious that he would actually do all the work required. So that's why I call him an incompetent director. He might have been good as a Secretary of State or somewhere in diplomacy, but he was not a spy master, and he certainly wasn't a very competent director of Central Intelligence.
One thing they did do, as soon as he got in there, the coup in Iran happened, and then the one in Guatemala happened afterwards. And they were both successful operations, and they were, not secret operations at all. Both of them were promoted.
Now, at the end.
After they happened, they were promoted in the press and the media. I'm sure Allen Dulle was promoting these things as great successes to make the Central Intelligence Agency look good. But then the next big operation that became well known was the U-2 plane that got shot down out of the sky, and then
they had all the failures in Eastern Europe where they tried to supply rebel groups, and it turned out that they were actually just funding the KGB.
Yeah, that happened, and then they were getting ripped off, funding people that were supposed to be against the Chinese that were ripping them off too, and they tried to foment a civil war in Indonesia that failed.
That's what I was just about
in the 1950s.
Yeah, I was just about to jump into some of the stuff in Indonesia. If you want, you can talk more about the war. I just have some operations they were doing around it. Yeah, it's up to you.
You can go ahead. I keep interrupting you.
Oh, it's fine. No. Hey, I enjoy the back and forth. I don't know everything. I'm glad to learn. A later reportedly ill-planned attempt at damaging President Sukarno of Indonesia, and this is the war that Mike was talking about, who did not favorably respond to Western overtures during the late 50s. The CIA under Dulles attempted to fund the rebels that were fighting the government and the communists by giving American pilots planes to bomb local installations held by the government. So Indonesia requested diplomatically over and over for us to stop it. We didn't. So they shot down one of these pilots and imprisoned him. Now,
which blew the operation.
Of course. Yeah. It revealed that we were supporting the rebels, and it damaged our connection with Sukarno and the government. So because they were not going to be able to diplomatically get this done, Dulles, according to one report, allegedly further had the CIA's Technical Services Division create a false pornographic film titled, quote, Happy Days, with a Sukarno imposter and a blonde woman asserted to be a Soviet agent it's a pornographic film, use your imagination. However, similar to many ill-advised plots authored by Dulles, the tape proved to be ineffective and did not produce the desired public damage. The public didn't believe it. I am familiar with the CIA setting up actresses and women for Sukarno when he visited the U.S. from research on a CIA project called Harpstar that was designed to use women of influence to push Sukarno into certain actions and gather intelligence. It would not be years later until U.S. officials supporting military leaders in Sukarno's administration may have influenced his eventual removal from power. So once again, we see another push operation where it's not like Arbenz, and it seems that they're good at just the roll-in military overthrow that they did at the beginning when they have a fairly good plan and they have agents in place, but all these longer term things never seem to work out. All these morale and psychological warfare operations and attempting to blackmail Sukarno and embarrass him publicly, none of that works. According to the book Legacy of Ashes by historian Tim Weiner, President Eisenhower, before his final days in office, told Dulles privately that because of the clandestine failures in the Cold War, he would, quote, leave a legacy of ashes for his successor. CIA sources are quick to note that Eisenhower was speaking about military intelligence, but since it was the job of the agency to centralize all intelligence, including sources from the military departments for the president, they do not escape culpability if they are not directly responsible. According to Weiner's book, Dulles would observe television baseball games distractedly while listening to intelligence briefings, and valued written briefings based on the weight of the completed paper. Both of which is just, yeah. If both of those are true, I'm annoyed.
I guess he was a Yankees fan, I'm guessing.
Yeah. This does not strike me as the obsessive micromanagement of Bedell Smith or the constant refinements of prior director Hillenkotter. It seems as if this is accurate, that Dulles, as the years passed, assumed such matters did not require his full attention. While indeed it would be unreasonable to state there was no major intelligence successes in this period, I would not attribute them to the, quote, stellar leadership of Allen Dulles. Instead, I would contend it was the earlier management staff appointed by Hillenkotter and redesigned organizational system of Bedell Smith that allowed Dulles to achieve his early successes. Yet the longer... I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I got someone sent me one of the new JFK files. What it is a itinerary diary for Dulles' successor, John McCone, with his daily schedule. Uh-huh. And it shows who he's meeting and all this kind of stuff. And it might be worth doing a show about that because it's interesting to look at, but it also gives you an idea of what these CIA directors are really doing, or at least in his case. So, I know there's something of a version of that, and David Talbot used it for Allen Dulles. I've looked at it. Allen Dulles had a diary too, but the John McCone one is a lot more detailed. The Allen Dulles one, it's almost like the guy is writing on a scrap of paper or something. He's not putting a lot of detail into it.
That's fine if you want to do that.
If what David Talbot, if the Allen Dulles itinerary is everything he's doing, he's not doing much. He's like having 3-4 meetings a day, basically.
Well, and that wouldn't surprise me compared to some of the other files we've looked at. He doesn't appear to be doing much a lot of the time. As for McCone, we can do that in a future show. I've gone through some of those files. I think it was like a year or two ago. I don't think it's from the new one, so there's probably more information in there. But that's where I found that it was McCone that actually convinced RFK to have the body sent back up, and it wasn't anything nefarious.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that it was McCone that said you'd just be wasting time flying down there to go get the body and bring it back. So like I said, I don't think I think it'd be unreasonable to say there were no major successes. There were, but I would attribute them to his predecessors building the right structure and putting the right people in a lot of the right positions that made the CIA in good shape for Dulles to be successful in the first couple of years. But the longer he was in charge, the more failures and mistakes occurred. And while I think part of that can be attributed to him embracing the code of OSS founder William Donovan about daring acts and contempt for organizational controls in the face of unique situations. And, I even saw in one agency review where they were talking about, they're praising Donovan for having an unspoken policy of ignoring legal mandates and official policy when agency leaders deemed it appropriate.
How do you run an organization like that?
Exactly. You're basically saying go screw yourself to the law when you feel like it. You can't. You can't run an effective, and that's what I think ultimately was one of the big roadblocks to Dulles ever getting done what he wanted. You can't just say, screw it, I'm going to do what I want, and then when everything falls apart, blame the system or blame the people responsible. You were the one who did it. You chose to ignore the mandates. You chose to ignore the policy, so don't be upset when it comes to bite you, as we'll see it will, and, shortly. Similar to his briefing episodes, Dulles in some respects had taken his eye off the ball, yet that did not stop him from swinging. During 1960, the CIA, under the direction of President Eisenhower and Dulles, grew concerned with Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba in the Congo because of his political connections to enemy political groups. To continue securing portions of Congolese uranium supplies for national security purposes, and to prevent a communist-aligned government from controlling the Congo, the CIA began assassination planning. Shortly before the CIA plans were directed to be undertaken, Leopoldville Station Chief Larry Devlin, instead of directly poisoning Lumumba, told Lumumba's political opponent he planned to seize power alone, and rebel forces removed Lumumba. This led to decades of a long military dictatorship instituted in the wake of the democratically elected government's overthrow.
Mm-hmm.
While portions of the CIA were concerned with Lumumba, in roughly the same period, Dulles would approve CIA leaders' attempts to assassinate Cuban revolutionary leader Fidel Castro in a series of failed attempts and unlikely operations. Small groups and single operatives would approach criminals, exiles, paramilitary leaders, and even Cuban officials to initiate the downfall of the Castro regime. Simultaneously, a much larger contingent of the agency and supporting military and paramilitary groups had been planning the invasion of Cuba. The operation from its beginning was a haphazard and compromised idea of less than coherent plots that did not eventually rely on military support, but relied on military intervention that President Kennedy did not support. The most significant problems were a lack of dependable paramilitary forces that were composed of competing and unfairly treated groups. Among these dissidents were Cuban spies and people that resented the differing quality and quantity of supplies that favored groups received. Add to this dysfunctional system of military objectives that largely relied upon ignoring the reality on the ground presented by some honest analysts. The problem, at least one official account noted, was a systemic enforced ignorance of the situation on the ground. Sources in Cuba did not offer positive developments. Many agents failed to establish networks that were not penetrated by Cuban intelligence. Agency stations demanded helpful reports. Agency officers ignored calls for alternative solutions that did not favor a paramilitary invasion. And despite the facts on the ground, the plans went forward and training was undertaken. Since Dulles endorsed officials were eager to remove Castro and expected that President Kennedy would be forced to support the invasion if things went awry, there were several upset people when the Bay of Pigs was a disaster and the Kennedy administration did not save them.
Well, Allen Dulles blamed Kennedy for this.
Yeah, I think a lot of people did.
I mean, he blamed Kennedy for not saving him, not saving the operation. That's why it failed.
Yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of the military commanders did too, because they totally expected that that's what was going to happen. But they had no right. They had no reason to expect that this was going to happen. The president was fairly clear that if things did not proceed as he thought they should, that he was not going to back it with air support. But they thought that, I guess, they could force him to do that, and it failed. And then all those people got imprisoned, and we had to make deals later to get them back.
And some were killed.
Yeah. And, I mean, I'm not saying that there was any necessarily right party in all of that, that it wasn't as if they just came to the idea themselves. The Kennedys did back a lot of illegal programs against Castro. Paramilitary programs, things that were not legal. So it's not like these people just came up with the stuff themselves, but when they assumed that they could force the president or any leader to have to support them despite what they said policy was, that was their mistake. And ultimately, it goes to the head of the organization, and the head of the organization was Allen Dulle.
Wow, and that goes back to the episode we did, I think it was two previous ones ago, about the problem of an intelligence agency. You know, after this all happened, as you found that document, Arthur Schlesinger wrote a huge memo about this disaster and what to do about it.
Yeah. Yeah, and even in the earliest of the CIA histories, they talked about how nobody was in charge. How that one of the enduring problems, and I guarantee it still exists today, is that no one is in charge. The responsibility is too diffused. And that stops us from being able to fix things. That just, they put Band-Aids on. And, you know, they just act like nothing is wrong. And they don't fix the problem. And then later on they wonder why it happens again. And then they go back and they look, if you go back and you look at the histories, I can tell you why it happens. Because they never fixed the problem. That's why it keeps happening. You know, I'm not saying that any of us has the solution, but what I am saying is that unless you have, it's in the title, Central Intelligence Agency, which means control has to be centralized through an authority, not through an endless amount of committees. You need to eventually come to a point to where you have someone who can say yes or no, that person, and that person ultimately would be the president, like we talked about in that one episode. And that he isn't told about some things is still baffling to me.
It is. It is pretty crazy.
Yeah. So, and that largely, I'd say, ended Dulles' political career for the most part. The failures of the Bay of Pigs and the aftermath, you know, everything was rightly laid at the top echelons of the CIA's establishment, who ignored the contrary intelligence reports, and it lay with those who desired the proxy wars despite the stated intent of higher authorities to limit clandestine actions. So Dulles approving the Bay of Pigs despite the problems does not suggest he was a master of clandestine operations, and it spelled the end of his tenure. He would resign likely at the private request of President Kennedy to prevent the public impression that he was fired, and Kennedy would award him a medal to thank him for his tenure. He left the agency in 1961 and would later sit upon the President's Commission investigating the death of President Kennedy, in which he withheld copious amounts of information from even other members of the Commission. And that same year, he would author a book on intelligence, which goes to show you how much time he spent on his investigation, The Craft of Intelligence. Years later, he would write, quote, Great True Spy Stories, and he died January 29th, 1969.
75 years old.
Yep.
You know, the thing about it, though, is he certainly did make the CIA a big thing, you know.
Well, an image. He was definitely good for their image.
That he accomplished.
Yes, yes. Well, and once again, I think that speaks to his diplomatic abilities. He was more, like we've talked about off air, like Lansdale, as far as he could sell things. He knew the right sort of image. He encapsulated, you know, the pipe-smoking academic, the insightful man who could tell you things that nobody else could because he was a attributed spy master, even though he wasn't. When you look at all of the files and the facts about him. He was great at making the spy master image, but he didn't actually encapsulate that. That's not what he was. He was the appearance of a spy master. He gave you the image of one, rather than actually being one.
And that was his magic.
Yeah. His magic was he could get you to believe what he wanted, rather than that he actually possessed the traits of what he claimed to be.
I'm just looking at a picture of him smoking that pipe.
Oh yeah, no, he was good at what he did, but I think that people were taken in by him if you believe all of the stories about him, because when you really look at the intelligence operations beyond what we talked about with the successful early ones, there was a lot of failures. He failed his way to the top, really. His image has been massaged over time by historians and favorable reviews. that he, accomplished some sort of great thing when not really. He really didn't have many great accomplishments. His brother, if anything, changed our government a lot more. Dulles just basically got to sail on the back of people who did the work before him.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to Vietnam, his brother, I mean, I know Ed Lansdale played a role in helping Jim out at the beginning, but really John Foster Dulles made that country, created it.
Yeah, and same thing with Chiang Kai-shek in China.
Yeah.
It was him that was talking about wanting to unleash Chiang Kai-shek on the communists.
Mm. Well, do you really, when you think of Allen Dulles, I mean, it's kind of funny that John Foster Dulles has kind of faded away in history, in the memory of people today, when, he was just as important or more important.
Well, maybe we'll do one on him. If people like this one, we'll do one on the older brother and see what we can find.
Yeah. Well, thanks for talking with me, and everyone should check out your website, Two Princes and a King, and grab your book if they don't have it already. I don't know why they wouldn't have it, but they should have it, and read it.
Well, thanks a lot, Mike. I appreciate you giving me a chance to come back. And yes, please do check out tpaak.com, tpaak.com. Lots of research resources, evidence. You're not going to see a lot of other places on the web, and links to other sites too that are reasonable and credible and have official files you can look at and verify for yourself.